We are right in the middle of our series. If you have not been with us for the last few weeks, we are in the middle of our series that we are calling I Am. And what we're doing with this series, we're looking in the Gospel of John at all of these, we call them I am statements. They're statements about Jesus that he makes about himself that give us some incredible insight into who he is. Because the thing that we have said for this entire series, what we want to do is we want to move past just looking at what Jesus does, looking at what Jesus has accomplished, and look at actually who he is, like who is Jesus? That's the question we want to answer, because by answering that question, we're able to grow deeper in our relationship with him. We're able to grow closer in our relationship with him, and we're able to take just one step closer to being more like him, which is, as Christians, what we are called to do. And with these I am statements, what we have said is every time Jesus makes one of these I am statements, essentially what he is doing is he is basically taking the covenant name of God from the Old Testament, Yahweh, which English translation for that is I am, and he takes it and he claims it for himself. And essentially, it's a statement that he makes about his own divinity. And what he does is he attaches a little metaphor to it, and he gives us, something that we can hold on to, and it gives us some incredible insight into who Jesus is. And so we're going to continue that this morning. If you got your Bibles, go ahead and flip over to John chapter 10. That's where we're going to land for our third I am statement. But this is a time, by the time we get to John chapter 10, just know this: we're getting close to the end of Jesus' public ministry. About halfway through, Jesus is actually going to end his public ministry. You're going to see him kind of draw back, and he's going to have some conversation with some really close friends, some of his disciples. You don't actually see Jesus show up on a public stage really again until he comes into Jerusalem for the Passover feast, which we call it Palm Sunday, right? So he's going to roll into town then, and you're going to see him with the crowds. But this kind of is the wrap-up of his public ministry as we go into today's message and into next week's message as well. But before we get into that, let me ask you a question. How many of you guys recognize this door? Anybody? Show of hands. Yeah, all you world travelers probably do recognize this. This is like one of the most famous residences in the entire world. It's 10 Downing Street. This is where the Prime Minister of Britain lives, right? So like Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, all of these people have lived at this address, 10 Downing Street. And the reason I bring this up is because that door is actually probably one of the most famous doors in all of the world. It was actually built in 1772. It's made of black English oak. And it's got these beautiful Georgian panels that are all on it. Now, what I got to say is that this is not the original door. What you're seeing here, this is actually a replica. Because what happened in 1991 was the IRA actually set off a pipe bomb, not at the door, but like a block away. And so the government decided, probably not a good idea to have this old door. So they built a replica, and it was like bulletproof, blast-proof, and they put this door in its place. And so it looks like the original thing. So like if you look in the middle, you see that little mail slot. People could go slip little notes into the prime minister there. It's just a facade. It doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't go into the door at all. That door handle that you see right in the dead center, it doesn't work. It's for show. You can't turn it and open the door. In fact, you cannot even access this door on your own from the outside to go inside. The only way you can get in, what you can't see is on the inside of this door, there's a guard. And 24/7, they have guards there. And what they do is they only allow the people in that the prime minister wants in. So the only way you can get in is if someone on the inside opens the door for you and allows you to come in. And the reason I say that is because today we're going to be looking at the third I am statement of Jesus. The third I am statement is found in John chapter 10, and this is what Jesus says. In John chapter 10, verse 9, he says, I am the door. If anybody enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. And I don't know if you know this or if you've ever taken like a deep dive study into doors and gateways and entryways in the Bible, but they're actually it's kind of cool. There's a big deal. You could almost do an entire sermon series just on the doors. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. The Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve sinned and God cast them out of the garden, right? The garden represented the place where they could experience Jesus or experience God. They could be face to face with God. They could experience the presence of God, and they're cast out of the garden. And what does God do at the end of chapter 3? He takes two cherubim, or what we would call angels, and he places them at the entry point back into the garden, and they have these big flaming swords, and they're guarding the entrance back into the presence of God. so that no one can just go back into the presence of God at that moment. You look in Genesis chapter 7, there's Noah. Noah's building his ark, right? He spends like 100 years building this ark, and then he finally gets it done, and the floods start coming, so he gets all the animals 2 by 2 on the boat. He gets his family in the boat, and what does it tell us at the end of 7? That the Lord himself closes the door and seals it. One door, one way in. That's the only way in. And God closes it and seals it. And then if you fast forward a little bit, when you look at the temple, the first temple, you had the temple court area, right? And there was only one way in, one gate, one door that allowed you to go into the temple to worship God. It's not like what we have here. You know, we got all these like fire restriction regulations and OSHA and stuff. So we got exits here, we got exits at the back, exits over here. They didn't have that. They had one way. Everybody came in and came out of the same way in the temple doors or in the temple courts. And then you had this one area that was known as the Holy of Holies. It was at the very center of the temple, right? And it was this one room where God's presence on earth was found. And it was guarded by this massive veil, this massive curtain, right, that guarded the door that entered into the Holy of Holies. And what you may not know is that on either side of it, just outside it, there were these two carvings, these two statues of angels holding swords, kind of replicating what we saw in the garden, guarding the entrance into the presence of God, because they didn't just let anybody in there. And then even once you got into the Holy of Holies, you had what? The Ark of the Covenant, right? The Ark of the Covenant, that was its resting place. That's where it resided. And on top of the Ark of the Covenant, there was a lid. The lid is actually referred to as the mercy seat of God because it symbolized God's throne on earth. This is where God sat on earth. And on either side of it, at the head and feet of either side of this ark, were two angels standing, peering over, guarding the throne of God, guarding the mercy seat of God. And once a year, only once a year, the high priest had the ability to go in, and it was always on the Day of Atonement. He would go in and he would make a blood sacrifice to atone for the sins of Israel for the past year. And they would sprinkle blood on the mercy seat of God. But it was only once a year that the person actually got to go in there. And in fact, it was such a big deal that when the high priest went in there, they would tie a rope to his leg. So in case he fell down and had a heart attack or something happened, no one else would go in. They would literally take the rope and drag his body out of the Holy of Holies. That's how important it was. But one way in, that's all. I say all that to drive this point home. Doors in the Bible were a big deal. The doors that we see, the gateways, the entry points were a big deal, which makes Jesus' claim here that I am the door all that more significant. It just gives it a little more weight and a little more punch. So let me set this up for us just a little bit before we get into this passage. What we see happening between basically chapter 7 all the way up to chapter 10 is happening roughly at the same time. If you were with us last week, you know we talked about what Jesus was doing in chapter 7. Jesus was actually in Jerusalem, and he was at what we call the Festival of Booths, or the Feast of Booths. And this was basically a huge celebration, a very joyous celebration. And what they were celebrating was the way God had provided for his people during the Exodus period. So that period of time when they were released from Egypt all the way up until the 40-year period till they entered into the promised land, God provided for his people. And so they would celebrate during this period. And then in this, what they basically had, there were two big ceremonies that they used to kind of honor this time and do this celebration. One was what we call the water ceremony. And what Jesus does is we see that he steps into this scene and he kind of just hijacks this ceremony. He makes it all about himself. This ceremony that was supposed to be a way of honoring God, what God did, back in the Old Testament, Jesus says, no, it's about me. He looks out at the crowd and he yells out, he's like, hey, anybody thirsty? Come see me. He said, and I will place in you rivers of living water. And then we see later that night, he has what we call the illumination of the temple. It was this big light ceremony, and Jesus steps in and says, oh, yeah, you want some light? I got your light right here. He says, I am the light of the world. Again, he hijacks their ceremonies. So you see how offensive this would have been to the religious leaders and the religious people at the time. Jesus just steps in and he hijacks this. Well, in the middle of this festival, we see at the beginning of John chapter 8, Jesus is confronted. The religious leaders are like, they're tired of it. They're offended by him, and they want to kind of trap Jesus. So they bring an adulterous woman, a woman who has been caught in the act of adultery, to try to trap Jesus. And the reason we know that they're trying to trap Jesus is because they don't bother to bring the man. The man was just as guilty. So they take this woman and put her at the feet of Jesus and said, hey, Jesus, Mosaic law, Old Testament law says that this woman, she's an adulteress. She deserves to be stoned to death. What say you? And Jesus is like, okay, we'll play your silly game. I'll go first, though. He said, let the first person, one of you that's perfect, the person that has kept the law completely from birth till now, you throw the first stone. And in this moment, they realize that the same judgment that they're wanting to dispense on this woman is the same judgment that they're due because nobody has been able to keep the law. No one is righteous in the eyes of God by themselves. And what Jesus is doing, he's turning it back on their head. And I love this moment because in the moment when he says that, he begins to look down. He's not paying attention to the crowd. And he looks up and he's talking to the woman. He's like, hey, who condemns you? Like, is anybody left over? Because all these guys would get up and leave one by one. And the woman, in this beautiful moment of submission, this beautiful moment of recognizing that Jesus is her Lord, she says, Lord, nobody's here to condemn me. And Jesus says to her, he says, all right. And he forgives her. He says, I don't condemn you either. And this is a big deal because only God could forgive sins. Like when you and I, we kind of have dust-ups, I can ask your forgiveness from you, and you can forgive me in a relational way, but you can't actually forgive sins. Only God can forgive sins. And here's Jesus telling this woman, your sins are forgiven. But I love the little add-on that he does. He actually tells her, he says, yeah, you're not condemned, but go and sin no more. In other words, what he's saying is that he is fully embodying both grace and truth in this moment, because that's what Jesus was. He was the full, complete embodiment, 100% truth, 100% grace. And that's what we see in this moment. And for many of you growing up, man, like maybe you had this in your house. You had parents. You had one parent that was all about grace, and you had one parent that was all about truth, right? And you always wanted to deal with the grace parent. You never want to have to deal with the truth parent. But that was just kind of how it went. That was the way it was in my house. Maybe you were kind of unfortunate and you had one parent that was all about truth and the other parent was all about truth. And that's not good, right? You don't want two truths in your house like that. Or maybe you had two parents that were both about grace. You had both parents were about grace. And that's not good either. We call that gentle parenting. That's why people don't like your kids when you do that. Just saying. But I love this moment. And so then we get to chapter 9. And in chapter 9, Jesus runs into this guy in the temple. He's a blind guy. The text tells us that he has been blind since birth. And so just to kind of keep the story kind of tight, Jesus performs what I think is probably the grossest miracle in the Bible. He sees this blind guy. He's going to heal him. So he leans down into the dirt and he spits in the dirt. And he takes his finger and makes like a little mud puddle, right, with it. And he takes some of the spit, mud, whatever, and he wipes it on the dude's eyes. And he tells the guy, he's like, hey, go down to the pool of Siloam, which was the ritual bathing site, and wash your eyes, and you're going to be able to see. So the guy's like, okay. So some friends take him down there. He washes his eyes, and lo and behold, he has his sight back. And so he comes back to the temple area where he was, and the crowds, they see this guy, and they're like, I thought you were blind. They're like, yeah, I was. He's like, yeah, maybe it's just someone that looks like you. No, that was me. I was blind, but now I see. He said, well, what happened? The crowds don't understand. He's like, I don't know. This dude named Jesus shows up. He spits on the ground and makes some mud, wipes it on my eyes. I go down here, I'll wipe it away. Now I can see. They're like, and they're perplexed. They have no idea what's going on. So then they take him to the Pharisees because they're the religious leaders. And he's like, hey, they'll know what to do. They'll figure it out. So he goes to the Pharisees and they're like, hey, you can see. He's like, yeah, I know. It's kind of cool. And they're like, what happened? And so he's like, okay, let me explain it again. Guy named Jesus shows up. He spits in the ground, makes some mud, wipes it on my eyes, tells me to go wash it. Now I can see. And they're mad. They're offended because this actually happens on the Sabbath day. And they actually go off and they actually interview him and interrogate him twice on the same. And same thing, he tells them again. He says, look, all I know is this guy named Jesus shows up. Spits in the ground, puts mud in my eyes. I go wash it, and now I can see. I was once blind, but now I see. And we see this beautiful moment because Jesus, and oh, by the way, the Pharisees get so mad, so offended that Jesus would do this. They actually kick the guy out of the temple. They tell him, you're not allowed to be in the temple because, why? Because he just testified of what Jesus did? Yeah. They were so mad at Jesus, they literally just kicked the guy out. And Jesus hears about this, so he approaches the guy. And he's talking to the guy, and he's like, hey, do you recognize who I am? You know who I am? And he's like, yes, Lord, I believe you. In this beautiful moment of submission, he calls Jesus Lord. He says, Lord, I believe you. And then by the time we get to the end of chapter 9, what we see is Jesus gets peppered with all these questions surrounding this miracle that he's just done, around this blind guy that he's done. And people are just hammering, like some of the Pharisees have seen this, and they're approaching him now as well, and they're asking him all these questions. But all of the questions they're asking him boil into this one question: Jesus, who are you? That's the question they're asking him. Jesus, who are you? Be straight with us, Jesus. Tell us, honestly, who are you? That way we can decide for ourselves whether or not we want to worship you, whether or not we want to surrender our lives to you. Just be straight with us. That's the question that he answers. And so when we get to chapter 10, which is our passage for today, Jesus is having this conversation with the Pharisees again, and he's answering this question, this very question: Jesus, who are you? And he's going to give them their answer. And what I love about it, he gives us one of the deepest, most profound answers that we find in the Bible, right? It's a long passage. We're actually going to break it into two parts. We're going to cover the first part today, and next week we're going to hit the second I am, the next I am statement, and we're going to talk about that one next week. But all of this week and next week is Jesus' response to the Pharisees after he's healed this blind guy. And I love what Jesus does because he's going to use this imagery, right? This imagery of things that they would have known very well. So he takes this idea of sheep and shepherds and shepherding, and he kind of stirs it all around, and that's what he's going to use to describe who he is. Now, you guys are pretty smart, right? So you know that when Jesus is talking about the sheep, who's he talking about? He's talking about us, right? I love that because in this story that he's laying out, we represent the sheep. And I don't know if you know this about sheep, but sheep are like dumb. They're like dumb as dirt. And you're like, some of you are offended to hear me say that. You're like, Michael, are you calling me dumb? No, I'm not calling you dumb. I'm saying you're like sheep. And sheep are dumb. You figure it out, okay? But that's what he's saying here. So let's see how he responds to the Pharisees starting in verse 1. This is what Jesus says. He says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold." Now, sheepfold is just a word for a sheep pen. They would want to corral their sheep at night, right? So they would just bring them in at night, and they would put them there to kind of control them. He says, "Those who do not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out." Verse 4, "When he has brought out all of his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers." This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying. And so here's essentially what Jesus is saying. He's actually kind of mixing metaphors a little bit, but that's okay because he's Jesus and he can do that. But essentially what he's talking about here is, so let me just untangle this for us a minute. In that culture at that time, there were two types of sheepfolds, two types of pens where you would corral sheep at night. You had the first one was called a city sheepfold. It was huge. They were permanently structured, high walls. You go over to that area of the country right now, you can still see the remnants of some of these sheepfold. They had big communal pens, and what would happen is the shepherds would bring their flock in, and multiple shepherds would use this pen. And they would actually pay a guard to stay up at night to watch over their sheep while the shepherds were able to go and get some rest and get some sleep. And you would have as many as 5 or 6 flocks of sheep mixed together in this area. And so what Jesus is saying, the question that comes to mind is this: like, okay, next morning you want to go get your sheep. How do you discern your sheep from the other sheep? Well, something you need to know about sheep is they have remarkably discerning hearing. Like, they're dumb as dirt, they don't see very well, but they can hear very well. And so what would happen is the shepherd would come, and his voice, he would speak to the sheep, and the sheep would recognize his voice, and they would come to him because they recognized the voice of the shepherd. See, thieves would actually try to break in sometimes. They would come in at night, and they would dress up like the shepherd, and they would go talk to the gatekeeper, that guard that had been paid, and sometimes they could trick the guard because they looked kind of like the shepherd. They would go in and steal some sheep. But what Jesus is saying, you're not going to fool the sheep. You can't fool them. You can't impersonate me. That's what he means in verses 4 and 5 when he says, my sheep recognize my voice and they follow after me. They do not follow after the imposter. That's what he's talking about. So you had the city sheepfold, but then you also had what we called country sheepfold. These were kind of dotted all throughout the countryside in random locations. They weren't as big. You got a picture of one of them. This one's actually a little more robust than most of them, but you notice the walls are pretty low. It's a small area, and these were often used when you were out and you couldn't make it back into one of the community spots. You could just park it for the night and put your sheep in that pen. But notice there's no door. So what would have to happen is the shepherd would actually lay down and sleep in the gap in there, and he would literally become the door. That's what he's saying. And these thieves would still try to come and steal their sheep. And, getting over that low wall is easy. But getting a hold of a sheep and getting his fat butt over the wall without making a bunch of noise and waking up the shepherd, that's hard. The only way you could get these sheep out is literally to come through the door. And he is laying there in the gap as the doorway, which is why Jesus in verse 1 says, the one who does not enter by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. And so Jesus is sitting here talking to these Pharisees, and essentially what he is saying is, that's you. You are the thief. You're the one who's trying to climb over the wall and steal the sheep. You're the one who's imitating the voice of the shepherd trying to steal the sheep. You are the thief. Now, pop quiz for you. Between the Pharisees and the woman, it was caught in adultery, and the blind man, which one of these was more theologically trained? Pharisees, right? Obviously. Which one of these had more smarts? Which one was considered more morally upright in life? It was the Pharisees, right? But yet they still didn't recognize the voice of the shepherd. They didn't recognize the voice of Jesus. Why? Because they hadn't surrendered to Jesus. They weren't one of his sheep. They weren't following after him. They hadn't surrendered to the lordship of who Jesus was. In fact, the Pharisees actually thought of themselves as the gatekeepers. They were the gatekeepers for the law. They were the gatekeepers for righteousness. Part of their job as Pharisees was to go around and tell other people how wrong they were. Like, that's actually what they did. They were the best at keeping the law and understanding the law, and they would hold people accountable. They considered themselves the door. So you can imagine how offensive it is when Jesus is sitting there telling them, I'm the door. So let's keep going. Verse 7. Verse 7 says, so Jesus again said to them, and I think he says this like rolling his eyes at them. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. And here's our verse, verse 9. He says it again, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pastures. Now, here's the interesting thing. They would have understood exactly what he was talking about when he laid out this imagery for them. But for us, there's three ways this morning that I think this passage kind of intersects our lives. When we think of Jesus as the door, when he says, I am the door, there's three things that I'm going to give us kind of like handles to grab a hold of this morning, where Jesus is saying, I am the door. This is how it impacts us. The first one is this. When Jesus says, I am the door, what he's saying that I am the only door to salvation. I am your only path. I am your only door to salvation. See, I don't know if you know this, but sheep, they kind of have a tendency to wander off. They get out in the pastures and they kind of start eating. They put their head down. They get lost. They kind of wander off from the crowds. They do their little thing over here. And most of the time, they don't even realize they're lost. Like, they just look up and they're like, dude, where am I? Like, I have no clue. They wander. They drift. They have no clue where they're at. And you and I, man, we're no different. We all have a tendency to drift. We all have a tendency to wander off. Isaiah 56 says it like this. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. So we all have this tendency to drift into sin. We all have this tendency to drift away from God. Like, no one has ever said, hey, you need to work really hard at sin. It's just who I am. It's baked into who I am. If I don't pay attention to my life and I'm not trying to actively pursue Jesus, I will naturally just drift into that type of life. I remember growing up, when I was young, we used to go to the beach every summer. And I remember as a little kid, I'd be out in the ocean. My parents were on the beach hanging out. I'd be in the ocean just playing, wouldn't be paying attention at all, just doing my own thing. And I would look up and I'm like, dude, why did my parents move like 200 feet down? Well, it wasn't that they had moved. The current had just drifted me that way. I didn't even realize I wasn't paying attention. And the next thing I knew, I had drifted all this way down. See, it doesn't take a lot of effort to drift away from God. In fact, the world around us will pull you that way if you allow it. If you're not actively trying to go against the grain, you will get pulled that way. The other thing that works against us is our own sin nature. Like Dallas Willard says it like this. He says, we're all built with what he calls a readiness to sin factor. And what he is talking about is that we baked into our DNA because of the fall, because of what happened in the garden years and years and years ago. We all have this tendency and this kind of orientation towards sin in our lives. And if we're not careful, if we're not constantly pushing against that, we will drift away from God. There's a real famous song. You guys might have heard of it. It's called Come Thou Fount. Love the song. It's a beautiful song written like in the 1700s. I think Phil Wickham maybe have done a remake of it. But there's this one line in the song. And it goes like this. He says, prone to wonder, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. And I love this song, but I hate that verse. I do, because it just hits a little too close to home for me. Like it's like a little bit of a gut punch and reminder that I, like this song, have a tendency to drift if I'm not careful. I have a tendency to wander away from God. And the question is like, have you ever been there? Have you ever found yourself in that situation? Like you're just going along with life, life's just happening, and you look up and you're like, how did I even get here? Like, how did I end up in this place that I am right now? Like my life, what I'm walking through is a flaming hot dumpster fire of a mess. How did I even get here? I didn't plan to be here. Like, how am I living out this lie that I never signed up for? How am I dealing with this addiction thing here? It's because we all have a tendency to drift. Like the sheep, we have a tendency to wander away. And Jesus says, I am the door. If anyone enters by me. See, I love that because what he's making here is a very exclusive claim. He is saying that he is the only way. He's saying, I am the door. I am the only way back into the presence of God. That's what he's saying when he says that those that enter by me. See, he doesn't say, I am a door. He doesn't say, I am one of many doors. He says, I am the door. He uses the definitive article when he says this, which means that he is the only entry point back into the presence of God. And just like we talked about when we said the garden, just like when we talked about the temple courtyard, just like we talked about with the Holy of Holies, just like with the mercy seat of God, there's only one entry point into the presence of God. And Jesus is sitting there saying, I am the one and only door that will bring you back into the presence of God. And I love the imagery that we see around both the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. Remember when Jesus is on the cross and it's getting towards the end, and he has this moment where he pushes up on his nail-pierced feet, and he takes that one last breath, and he says, Tetelestai, it is finished. Remember what happens in that moment? The veil that guarded the door into the Holy of Holies tears in two from the top to the bottom, signifying that access to the presence of God was now available to people. It's this beautiful reminder in this moment that Jesus' torn body would now be the way back into the presence of God. And I love the way he says this. Do you remember when we talked about the garden? We said, Adam and Eve are kicked out, and what do? They put two angels there to guard the entry back into it, right? So you had these angels. And then in the Holy of Holies, it was guarded by two carvings of angels, right? And then even on the mercy seat of God, there's two angels sitting there guarding the throne of God, the presence of God. And there's a small detail that sometimes gets overlooked in the resurrection story, and it's Mary. On the morning of the resurrection, when Mary shows up early that morning to go to the tomb because she wants to finish preparing the body because they had to hastily prepare it, she's going to prepare Jesus' body for final burial. And what does she find? The rock's been rolled away. She looks inside, and there's two angels dressed in white, sitting right where Jesus' body was, one at the head, one at the foot. Like, do you see the imagery that's being created there? Do you see what's going on? It's basically saying that Jesus is now the new mercy seat of God, that he is the way to the presence of God. He's saying that those flaming swords of judgment that was owed to all of us, he took that and endured that for us on the cross. And now we get to step into the presence of God. He is the only entry back into God's presence. And look, there's a common belief, and I get it, like in our culture today, there's this common belief that all roads lead to God. Like they have this image of a mountain, and like there's all these paths that go up that represent all the different religions, but they all end up at God, right? But that's not what we see here. That's not what Jesus is saying. In fact, all throughout the Gospels, he's saying over and over and over again, I am the only way. See, when you believe that all roads lead to God, you don't have the gospel. What you have is Oprah. Like you get a salvation, you get a salvation, you get a salvation, we all get a salvation. That's not what he's talking about here. Do you see how out of sync that is with what Jesus is saying, with what the Bible teaches? See, over and over and over again, Jesus says, I am the one and only way. I am the door to get you back into the presence of God. And I get it. This is very exclusive language when he says this. Very exclusive. Some people will hear this and they're like, man, that is so arrogant. That is so offensive to say that he is the only way. I mean, the Pharisees were offended by what he was saying. The Pharisees are hearing it, and they're offended by his words as well. But it would be arrogant and it would be offensive if it wasn't true, unless his words are true. And when Jesus gets up on that third day and he walks out of the tomb, he says that all things are possible, and I am proving to you that it is in fact true. So the first thing, when he says, I am the door, that he is the door to our salvation, the only door. Second thing is this, that when he says, I am the door, he is saying that he is the door to our security, that we have security with him. And I don't know if you know this about sheep, but sheep are very vulnerable. They have no natural defense mechanisms. They're actually pretty defensive. They're constantly in need of protection. And when a sheep wanders off and it can't protect itself, it's in danger. And I don't know, have you ever looked at a sheep and been scared? I mean, they're just not scary, right? They're cute and cuddly and fluffy, but they're not scary. They're not. In fact, like I remember when Hannah Grace was small, for Easter one year, we got her a little stuffed lamb, right? And she would sleep with it and cuddle with it, and she loved it because it wasn't scary. It wasn't. And remember what do you say to people when they say, oh man, I can't sleep at night? What do you tell them to do? You count sheep, right? Why? Because sheep aren't scary. You don't tell them to go count ninjas because ninjas are dangerous and scary. You tell them to count sheep. How many of you guys have ever heard of this thing? This is a new thing to me. It's called mutton busting. Anybody ever heard of that? It's actually a sport. You see it mostly in Texas. Essentially, it's like toddler rodeo. What they do is they take like their 5 or 6-year-old and they put them on a sheep and they send them out into the pen and they're like riding the bull to see, or riding the sheep to see who can stay on the longest. You're not going to put your child, your 5-year-old or 6-year-old, on a bull. You're not going to put them on a bronco because that's dangerous. But you'll put them on a sheep. You know why? Because sheep aren't scary. Sheep aren't dangerous in and of themselves. And the reality is we are just like them. We're exactly like those sheep. Like, don't get me wrong, we'll flex. We'll kind of bow up and we'll kind of convince everybody that we got our act together. We'll actually try to establish a pecking order amongst ourselves. But the reality is we aren't. We're weak. We're defenseless. Like on our own, we're much weaker than we think. When it comes to fighting the enemy, when it comes to going head to head with the enemy, we are defenseless. Like left to our own defenses, we will lose every single time. On our own, we will never be able to stand against the enemy. Like one-on-one against the enemy, he wins every time. You've heard me say this. Like if you try to fight your battles against the enemy by yourself, he is going to kick your butt every single time. And what he is saying, Jesus is saying here, when he says, I am the door, he says, if anyone enters by me, he says, he will be saved. And I love that. And what Jesus did, Jesus at God's divinely appointed time, he was sitting in heaven, and he's on his throne. And God looks over and nods, says, it's time. Jesus gets up from his throne, takes off his crown, takes off his royal robes, and he enters the pages of history and the pages of humanity. to serve as a rescue mission for us, to basically do for us the thing that we could not do for ourselves. That's what he's saying in this moment. Jesus is the door, and he came to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. Do you know what happens when you're saved? Like when you surrender your life to Christ, there's several things that happen, right? One is your sins are forgiven, right? Like Jesus takes your sins to the cross with him. That means your sins are forgiven. Also means that God's righteousness is now imputed on you. You're covered in God's righteousness, so you're able to stand righteous in front of God. You get to experience God's grace and God's love in a very profound way. The Holy Spirit takes up residence in you. He indwells in you. He makes you a new creation. But do you know one of the things that I love the most about what it means to give your life to Christ? It's adoption. It means we're adopted into God's family, that we are now part of God's family, that we are able to enter into God's sheepfold, to God's kingdom, which means for us, our future is secure. That's what he's talking about when he says, you enter by me, you will be saved because your future is secure. And I hear this question a lot. People will ask me, can I lose my salvation? And the way I like to say is that that's the wrong question, man. The question is, can God lose one of his children? And the answer is no. Look at what he says, how Paul says it in Romans. Paul says it like this. He says, for I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things, nor present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all of creation. And I'm pretty sure he covered everything there. So nothing will separate us from the love of God. And I love how he ends it. He says, in Christ Jesus our Lord. Beautiful moment. So yeah, we're part of God's family. It means our future is secure. We have eternal salvation because of that. But here's what it also means. It means that Jesus is with us all the time. He's always there. He's always with us. Like when we have those awesome high moments in our life, and Jesus is right there celebrating with us. And when we're going through a low point in our life, Jesus is right there picking us up, helping us along, helping us to make it through. See, like, Jesus never promised us an easy life. That's not what he's talking about. He doesn't promise us necessarily a comfortable life. In fact, he tells us oftentimes we're going to take it on the chin for him. But what he does say is that he will be with us. Matthew 28:20, this is literally Jesus is getting ready to ascend to heaven after his crucifixion and resurrection. He says, I will be with you always. Hebrews 13:5 says it like this. He says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. This also means that we don't have to face the enemy by ourselves. We're in God's family. He is with us always. It means we do not have to face the enemy alone. Anybody ever see this image before? I love this image. It's really kind of cool. This is kind of how I view my relationship with God. Like I'm that little cub, and I think I'm all tough and bad, and I might make a little kind of sound. But when the forces come after me, they're going to destroy me if I don't have someone backing me up. And then there's Jesus right behind us. You know what I'm saying? Like he's right there protecting us, looking after us. He's our first line of defense in all of these things. Jesus is the door, which means he lays down in the gap. And if anybody wants to come after you, they have to go through him first. That's what it meant to be the shepherd. That Jesus is with us means we don't have to live in fear. We don't, because Jesus is with us. So it means we enter into the sheepfold. We enter into his family. And we do that by Jesus because we are his adopted sons and daughters. We're adopted into the family of God. Our souls are secure. Jesus is with us. So that's the two things, right? So Jesus as the door means we have salvation through him. It also means that we have security in him. And here's the third thing that it does. When Jesus says, I am the door, he means that he is the door to true freedom. He is that door to true freedom. Sheep have this habit, if you don't know this, when they're out grazing, especially if they're like in a tight spot, they'll start eating the grass. And once all the blades of grass are done, they'll start eating the roots from the grass. And then once they're finished eating the roots, what they'll do is they'll stay right there and they'll start eating the dirt and the rocks, all the way to the point if they'll get up into their intestines and actually kill them. It actually destroys the sheep if you don't allow them to graze freely and go into different places. But the reality is we are just like the sheep. How many times have we got locked in on something and we don't see the freedom and experience the freedom the way we want to? So we just kind of keep going and keep going. Then we look up and we're in this self-destructive place. See, Jesus' words ring true here. He says, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. And I love this part. He says, will go in and out and find pasture. What Jesus is saying, he's saying, I am your door to freedom. I am the door to your freedom, the true freedom that you have. Galatians 5:1 says it like this. He says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. And we all hear that and we're like, oh man, I love that. That sounds so cool. Wait, what? What does that mean? Like, what does that even mean? Like we've been freed? I don't understand what he's saying. Here's what Jesus is saying. He's saying that his finished work on the cross has freed us. And then that freedom that we now have isn't a means to a greater end. But actually, the freedom is the end goal, that we are to live our lives free. That's what he's saying here. Now, here's the thing about freedom. Freedom is one of those words in our culture that gets kind of hijacked. Like our culture takes that word freedom and twists it and gives it a completely different meaning. It actually is kind of an egocentric type of meaning of freedom when we hear it. What it basically means is like, I do what I want. I do what I want, when I want, where I want to do it, and there's no consequences. Or I don't want to do that. No consequences for that either. And I get it. Like nobody likes rules. But we don't. Like I'm that way. I don't like rules. I remember a few months ago, it was December. My wife and I, Jill, we were taking our niece to the Biltmore for the big Christmas celebration. It had all the lights and all the decorations and stuff out. And everywhere I looked, there were these little signs that said, do not touch, do not touch, do not touch. Well, you know what I did? Touch. Touch, 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 touch. And Jill's looking at me like, are you a child? Like what's wrong with you? And I'm like, I might be a child, but ain't nobody gonna tell me what I can't do. You know what I'm saying? We just don't like rules in our lives. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. When he is talking about freedom, biblical freedom is theocentric. It's not egocentric. It means that it is oriented towards and around God. That's the freedom that he has for us. See, the way the Bible says it, that we are a slave to something, everybody. Everybody here is a slave to something. Romans 6:16 says it like this, you are slaves to the one you obey, either sin, which leads to death, or obedience, which leads to righteousness. So you get to choose what you're going to follow, but you're going to be a slave to something, essentially is what he's saying. See, true freedom, the freedom that Jesus is offering here, means two things for us. The first thing is this, that we have the freedom from the power of sin over our lives. That's what he's saying. We have that kind of freedom. Romans 6 tells us that we were freed from sin through Jesus Christ. And the enemy, though, the enemy knows this. He knows our nature. He knows that we don't like rules. He knows that we don't like being told what to do. And so what he's going to do is he uses our sinful nature against us oftentimes. Like all we want is freedom with no consequences, but the enemy's going to come and he's going to tempt us. And you know that like in in 1 John, there's only 3 quivers that he has in that arsenal of temptation. We call it 3 things. It's the lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and pride of life. Lust of the eyes means I see something with my eyes. There's possessions. I want those possessions for myself, and now I can't live without them. I didn't even know I wanted it until I saw it, but now I've seen it and I can't unsee it. I want it. Lust of the flesh. It feels good. Like I just like the way that feels, so I'm just going to keep pursuing that thing over and over and over, no matter what. Or pride of life. You see someone that's got something or has a status that you want. Like you thought you were living a great life and you loved your life until you realized what that person has, and now you want what they have. It's all about elevating yourself. It's elevating your stance. And that's what Jesus will use against you over and over again. See, let me ask you a question. How many bass fishermen we got in here? Anybody fish for bass? Really? No? I guess you don't have a boat either? Okay, no worries. We'll scratch that. Anyway, so if you're a bass fisherman, let me just kind of break this down for you. This is how Satan works, right? He goes out on his little boat and he attaches these lures that he's going to put out in front of you. So he grabs like a spinner bait and he takes it, hooks it on, and he throws it out there, and we're out there as like these little bass, and we see that little spinner bait come by and we're like, ooh, that's like a dancing disco ball. I love that. And you're like, no, don't touch that, man. What are you, crazy? Don't do that. And he gets it back in. He's like, oh, that didn't work? Okay, take the spinner bait off. I'll put a crankbait on. I'll just put a crankbait on, and he throws it out to us. He starts working that crankbait, and he's like, man, that looks like a little fish that's in distress, man. I need some of that. You're like, no, don't touch that. Don't bother that. He's like, okay, well, that didn't work. So he takes that bait off, puts the worm on, the old faithful, right? The worm. And he pitches that worm out in front of him. And it's like a free meal. It's like you don't even have to work for it. It's like drive-through. You just grab a hold of it. And what do? We grab a hold of that worm. And next thing you know, a hook is in that worm, and he hooks us. And now we spend all of our time trying to fight that hook. That's what he's talking about here. He's going to try to throw things at us to make us feel free. And the reality is, sin and rebellion always feel like freedom and fun in the beginning. They always do. The problem is it always ends in death and destruction. Freedom always feels like, or sin always feels like freedom at first. It's just what happens over time. See, we have a dog, Gumbo. Most of you guys know Gumbo. He's awesome. He's actually not even my dog. He's technically my daughter's dog. And when we were trying to train Gumbo into going into the crate, dude did not like it. He didn't want to give up his freedom. I understand that. Like we would yell for him, crate, and he would take off running and go hide under the bed or something. And I'm like under the bed, like grabbing him by the tail, trying to pull him out to get him into the crate. And it was like fighting him all the time. But then I realized, you know what Gumbo does like? He likes treats. So what we would do is I would call and I would tell him crate, and I would show him the treat, and he'd come follow me, and I would throw the treat into the crate. He would run in after it to get his treat. I'd slam the door, and I'm like, oh, dumb dog. You just gave up your freedom for a little treat. How dumb are you? But then I walk out the door. Satan hangs that little treat right in front of me. Oh, really? Huh? And so I go after it. That's what he does. We give up our freedom because we think what we're getting is fun and freedom in the end. But ultimately, we're making ourselves slaves to those things. Biblical freedom is about being released from the slavery of sin. But it's not just about what we're freed from. We're actually freed towards something. We're freed for something. That we were all created as image bearers of God. That we were all created in his likeness. And that we were all created to live our lives in a certain way. Our lives in a way that is both honoring and glorifying and that worships God in all things. It's freedom to live our lives for God. That's what biblical freedom talks about. We get to live our lives for God. And I get it. Like, man, the Bible has all these rules, right? And in our nature, we don't like rules. We want to make the rules ourselves. We don't want to follow after God's rules. We just want to do our own thing. But think of it like this. God oftentimes puts boundaries around the things that he treasures the most. You know what I'm saying? Like his instructions, his guidance, his commands that he gives for our life, he oftentimes puts those around the things that he treasures the most. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Take the covenant of marriage. God treasures the marriage covenant. And so what he does is he gives us rules about how we're supposed to live our lives up until we're married, about how we're to conduct ourselves, how we're to relate to other people, how we're engaging with other people, the people we're supposed to seek after, the people we're supposed to seek to marry. And then even within the sanctity of the marriage, like he gives us rules of how we're supposed to live our lives within the marriage. Like husbands, how we're supposed to love our wives, wives, how we're supposed to love our husbands. And he puts these boundaries in place because he just values and treasures the sanctity of marriage. And every single time we see all these rules that God has, that's what he's doing. He's protecting something that he values deeply and that he treasures. And see, it's this kind of freedom from sin, freedom to live our life for God. It's this type of freedom that leads us to joy, like pure joy. You know what I'm saying? Like a deep, deep, profound joy that we've never been able to experience. It's also what allows us to have peace. The Bible says it like this, a peace that surpasses all understanding. Like you're walking through some drama in your life and your friends are coming up like, dude, how are you making it through this? I don't know, I just got God. But I'm at peace. Like it makes no sense. It's just a peace that you don't even understand. It's contentment. It's able to weather whatever you have and being content where you are and who you are in those moments. And that's what he's talking about. Jesus is saying, I am the door to that. I am the door to all of that freedom. I am your door to that. And so Jesus, as we wrap this up today, Jesus is sitting there. He's standing there having a conversation with these Pharisees, these very religiously devout people that were better than everybody else. They were very self-righteous people. And his message to them is exactly the same message that he has for us today. It's the exact same message. Jesus is there and he says, I am the only door that you have to salvation. You don't climb over the fence like some of the religious people do. You don't try to sneak around with good works. You don't try to earn your way into the sheepfold. He says, the only way into the presence of God is me. I am that door. He says, I am the door to your security. Like when you walk through that door, you are automatically in God's family. And God never leaves you. He never forsakes you. He never abandons you. You never are left unguarded. He has your future and it is secure. You are never outside of the love of God. It says, I am the door to your freedom, true freedom. Not what the world says is freedom, but freedom from sin, freedom from shame, freedom from trying to prove yourself over and over in this broken world. Freedom to live your life in a way that God created you to live it. You're living for the purpose that he has designed you for. And so the question we have this morning that we have to deal with is not, do you know the door? The question is, have you walked through? Have you walked through the door? Because that door, it's not locked. It's open. The invitation is there. All you have to do is walk through the door. That's what he's saying. Let me pray for us this morning.